How did a country with the largest oil reserves in the world become one of the most economically destroyed nations in history? Venezuela, once an economic powerhouse in Latin America with vast oil reserves, is now synonymous with crisis, inflation, and misery. With an economy that lost more than 80% of its GDP in less than a decade, the country is facing one of the greatest economic collapses of all time. But how did this happen? In the 2000s, the country experienced a boom with oil prices soaring. What seemed like a promising future turned into a nightmare. Corruption, mismanagement, and the overdependence on oil were key factors in this collapse. And amid all of this, international isolation and economic sanctions made recovery even more difficult. Today, more than 6 million Venezuelans have fled the country in search of a better life, while those who remain face food shortages, lack of medicine, and a shattered economic system. But is there still hope for Venezuela? How can it recover from this absolute collapse? Stay with us until the end to understand all the details behind the fall of Venezuela's economy and what could be done to rebuild it. And of course, if you like content about global economics, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Venezuela, a country that for many years was the pride of Latin America due to its vast oil reserves. With the discovery of its natural wealth, the country seemed to have everything needed to become a global powerhouse. In the 1920s, Venezuelan oil exports skyrocketed, positioning the nation as one of the world's largest producers at the time. For most of the 20th century, Venezuela was one of the region's most prosperous economies, experiencing significant growth and holding a prominent place on the international stage. But, as with many resource-rich countries, Venezuela's history is marked by significant missteps. By 1935, Venezuela was already one of the largest oil producers in the world, with its economy nearly entirely dependent on this wealth. The government relied on black gold extraction, but as happened in many other nations, this extreme dependence quickly revealed itself as a vulnerability. During the following decades, the country fell victim to Dutch disease, an economic phenomenon where the booming natural resource sector weakens other vital industries. This made Venezuela dependent on imports for basic needs, a problem that would persist into the present day. However, the true peak of Venezuela's economy came in the early 2000s when oil prices soared. With a populist government at the helm, the country experienced an economic boom driven almost entirely by oil exports. Chávez's government used oil revenues to finance social programs such as food and medical subsidies, free education, and infrastructure reforms. The population, struggling for years, found temporary relief. But this prosperity was far from sustainable. The government did not invest in diversifying the economy, betting everything on oil, and failed to implement policies to prevent the collapse when oil prices fell. And that is exactly what happened. In 2014, oil prices dropped sharply, and with it, Venezuela's main revenue stream evaporated. The economy, accustomed to a steady influx of easy money, had no reserves or alternative economic engines to rely on. The government, unable to adapt, found itself helpless. What was once a blessing became a curse, and the country's economy plummeted. Looking at other oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia, it is clear that with better planning, Venezuela could have made oil a sustainable source of wealth. For example, Saudi Arabia invested in a sovereign wealth fund and worked to diversify its economy, while Venezuela failed to do so and is now paying the price for this lack of foresight. The tragedy of Venezuela is not oil itself, but its inability to use it to build a more stable and prosperous future. The country failed to transform its wealth into a motor for diversified development. Black gold wasn't enough to guarantee the prosperity once hoped for, and the Venezuelan economy is now paying a very steep price for this failure. Venezuela, with its vast oil reserves, should have been the model of success for any country rich in natural resources. After all, oil is one of the world's most valuable commodities, and any nation with control over its reserves can achieve great economic feats. However, Venezuela's history shows that when poorly managed, black gold can be both a blessing and a curse. Starting in the 1950s, Venezuela began extracting large amounts of oil, which allowed for accelerated growth. The economy flourished, with oil production accounting for about 90% of the country's exports. But this was a double-edged sword. While the country seemed to be on the rise, the growth model was almost entirely sustained by the sale of oil. which left the economy vulnerable to global fluctuations in energy markets. When oil prices were high, as in the 2000s, Venezuela experienced a boom, but when the market collapsed, the country quickly plunged into crisis. In the 2000s, under Hugo Chávez's government, Venezuela experienced an economic boom fueled by oil exports and soaring oil prices. Chávez, with his populist policies, used the wealth generated by oil to fund social programs, such as subsidized food and medicine, free education, and infrastructure reforms. The population, already struggling, found temporary relief. But this prosperity was far from sustainable. The government failed to make the necessary investments to diversify the economy, betting everything on oil, and did not take steps to prevent a collapse when oil prices fell. If there's one factor that stands out as the primary cause of Venezuela's economic collapse, it's undoubtedly the rampant corruption and mismanagement of resources. The idea that a resource-rich country is destined to prosper is a myth, especially when the leadership fails to manage these resources responsibly. Venezuela serves as a clear example of how poor administration and corruption can turn vast economic potential into disaster. Under Hugo Chávez's government, Venezuela experienced one of the most significant periods of corruption in its history. Although the government used oil revenues to fund social programs and infrastructure projects, much of this money was either diverted or mismanaged. The lack of transparency and the absence of oversight allowed billions of dollars to disappear. Furthermore, critical sectors like healthcare, education, and security, which should have benefited from oil wealth, deteriorated due to mismanagement and a lack of long-term investment. Chávez, who governed the country for 14 years, was also responsible for a series of reforms and expropriations of private businesses, claiming these measures would strengthen the national economy. However, these actions led to a departure of both foreign and national companies, who began to view Venezuela as a high-risk market. Without foreign investments and a loss of financial confidence, the country was unable to modernize its infrastructure or industrial processes. But the corruption didn't stop there. After Chávez's death, his successor, Nicolás Maduro, continued to follow the same path of mismanagement. During his administration, corruption spread even further through the government ranks, with both government officials and businessmen close to the regime caught in embezzlement schemes. The scandal involving the state oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., exemplifies the severity of the problem, with company officials accused of stealing millions of dollars in oil contracts. The impact of corruption was devastating to the economy. The government not only lost the trust of the people, but also pushed away potential investors, who were already wary of the political instability. Venezuela's economic model, which relied on oil, could have been more successful with a transparent government committed to good management. Instead, personal interests and a lack of long-term vision destroyed what could have been one of the world's most powerful economies. Today, Venezuela faces a miserable reality, with most of the population living below the poverty line. Corruption has destroyed the country's ability to reinvent itself, and what remains is an economy in ruins, incapable of generating jobs or wealth. The current situation is a clear reflection of how the combination of corruption and mismanagement can ruin even a country rich in natural resources. Venezuela's international isolation and the sanctions imposed by powers like the United States have only worsened the country's internal economic crisis, creating a nearly impossible scenario for recovery. Venezuela's foreign diplomacy, already struggling due to its political stance, became even more complicated as the country distanced itself from the world's major economies. The growing governmental inefficiency, paired with a confrontational approach to the international community, only intensified the nation's struggles. Since 2005, the U.S. government has imposed sanctions targeting individuals and entities tied to the Venezuelan regime in response to anti-democratic practices, human rights violations, and corruption. These sanctions, initially having a limited impact, grew in intensity and scope over the years, severely limiting Venezuela's ability to access international markets and attract foreign investment. The ban on oil imports, for instance, deprived the country of vital revenue it heavily depended on. Additionally, sanctions directly affected the production and export of oil. Venezuela, with its vast reserves, should have been able to capitalize on the global energy market, but isolation and financial restrictions made it increasingly difficult to sell its oil, which continues to be the country's main source of revenue. Foreign companies and banks, fearing repercussions from sanctions, withdrew from the country, worsening the collapse of infrastructure and essential services. The aggressive stance taken by Maduro's government also contributed to Venezuela's further alienation from potential international allies. The attempt to annex Guyana, a neighboring country, over territorial disputes related to oil reserves in the region, further isolated Venezuela in the global community. The move was widely condemned internationally and led to the intensification of sanctions, as well as damaging the country's attempts at dialogue with other Latin American nations. Venezuela, once seen as an oil powerhouse, now finds itself at the mercy of its own political decisions, with an ever-deepening isolation. The lack of access to international financial markets and exclusion from organizations like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has made it impossible for the country to fund its own development. This, combined with the withdrawal of major corporations and the lack of investment, has created a vicious cycle of crisis with no immediate prospect of recovery. With the population already facing shortages of food, medicine, and other basic necessities, the country not only misses out on growth opportunities, but also sees an unprecedented wave of emigration. More than 6 million Venezuelans have left the country since 2014, fleeing political turmoil and economic instability. Therefore, the impact of sanctions goes beyond the economy. It directly reflects on the lives of the citizens, who continue to bear the brunt of a government that failed to build international alliances and a political system that ignored the needs of the population. After years of sharp decline, the question that looms is, can Venezuela still recover? The crisis that has engulfed the country has affected almost every aspect of daily life, from skyrocketing inflation to mass migration, and with a collapsing economic system, recovery seems distant. However, by looking at the history of other nations that faced economic collapse, we can outline some potential paths. Though Venezuela's situation is unique, one of the most essential conditions for Venezuela's recovery is a radical change in governance. The lack of trust in local authorities, coupled with corruption at all levels, has been a major barrier to any attempt at recovery. The country cannot prosper without restoring trust from both its population and the international community. Leadership change, implementation of institutional reforms, and the creation of a transparent system are crucial for Venezuela to begin its recovery. However, as long as Nicolas Maduro's regime remains in power, this recovery seems unlikely. The weakening of democratic institutions and the lack of real political dialogue make reform a difficult task. Additionally, Venezuela desperately needs to diversify its economy. The exclusive dependence on oil, which once fueled the country's prosperity and later led to its downfall, must be overcome. Venezuela has abundant natural resources such as gas, gold, and minerals, but lacks the infrastructure to effectively extract and utilize these resources. For real recovery to take place, a comprehensive economic diversification plan is needed. One that includes massive investments in other sectors such as agriculture, technology, and manufacturing. The country has the potential to reinvent itself, but this will require not only political reforms, but also deep economic reforms that promote innovation and competitiveness. Another critical point is human capital. The mass exodus of highly skilled professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, and other specialists has been one of the greatest tragedies of this crisis. The exodus of more than 6 million Venezuelans has left the country without its most qualified workforce, making recovery even more difficult. Investing in the return of these professionals and attracting new talent will be essential. To achieve this, the country would need significant improvements in living conditions, security, and job opportunities. From an international perspective, Venezuela remains largely isolated, but there are faint signs of rapprochement. Some Latin American countries, including nations like Mexico, have expressed interest in collaborating with the Venezuelan government. However, without substantial changes in its political and economic approach, any external aid will be limited. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and other international bodies have avoided providing assistance due to the lack of trust in the authorities and the political instability. The solution lies in re-establishing diplomatic relations and creating an environment conducive to international investment. Finally, it's important to remember that the recovery of a country does not happen overnight. For Venezuela to rise from the hole it finds itself in, it will need a combination of deep internal reforms, restoration of confidence, and a commitment to economic diversification. However, with the current regime in place, recovery seems like a monumental task, and the next few years will be crucial in determining the nation's future. The question remains, does Venezuela have a way out? After this analysis, the answer is complex. The country needs deep political, economic, and social reforms to begin its recovery. However, as long as the current regime remains in power, recovery seems distant. The government must restore both internal and external trust, diversify the economy, and bring back the talent that has fled. Will Venezuela be able to rise from this crisis, or is the decline irreversible? Comment below with your thoughts on the future of Venezuela's economy. Do you believe the country has a chance of recovery, or is the worst yet to come? If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more insights on global economics. And if you want to understand more about how other countries are facing economic crises, click on the video here on the side.